Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion. It is looking at the overview of our constitutional framework, and particularly focusing on human rights in a state of disaster. We'll be covering issues of legislation, the Disaster Management Act, also issues of human rights, and particularly socioeconomic rights and public health issues. My name is Judith February, and I'm really looking forward to chairing this panel today. And I'd like to welcome our three panelists, one of whom has a clash, and so she will be, her message will be recorded, and we'll insert that, but she will join us for the Q&A. For those of you who are online, please let us have your questions in the question and answer session. The way in which we're going to run this session is each panelist has 10 minutes to speak, and I'll be then engaging with them, and depending on how many questions you all have in the chat. So an hour is not a long time for this rather broad topic, so I'm going to get right to it. Just to introduce our panelists today, Professor Almin du Plessis, who's will be joining us later, is an associate professor in the Faculty of Law at Northwest University, and she has particular interests in issues of expropriation without compensation and property law, but particularly a passion for finding the human element in law. And then I'm happy to also welcome Dr. Musiwalo Moses Kangali, who is currently a Director of Fire Services within the National Disaster Management Centre. He's been there since 2011, and he was also the Deputy Director responsible for administration and oversight of the National Felton Forest Fire Act in the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries. And so Dr. Kangali, I think, will have quite a bit to share with us, and particularly when we look at issues of disaster management. And then coming up first is Professor Sandy Liebenberg, probably known to you all for her work on economic and social rights. She is the Harry Oppenheimer Chair in Human Rights Law and a distinguished professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of Stellenbosch. Sandy has a long and illustrious CV, and she is an editorial boards of a number of human rights journals, and she is also the author of the monograph Socioeconomic Rights, Adjudication Under a Transformative Constitution, and the co-editor of Law and Poverty, Perspectives from South Africa and Beyond. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sandy to kick us off. Sandy, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, Judith, and good afternoon to all the participants in this winter school. It's a great honor for me to address you on the topic of socioeconomic rights during the COVID pandemic. So the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres made the following statement on the global impact of the coronavirus pandemic. Never before, he said, has the importance of the responsibility of governments to protect people by guaranteeing their economic and social rights been so clearly demonstrated. And indeed, it has been so demonstrated. Countries that invested in socioeconomic rights, such as quality universal healthcare, comprehensive social protection, decent housing, adequate water and sanitation supplies, were proved to be much more resilient and better equipped to cope with the shock of the pandemic. As we know, in the South African context, the COVID pandemic and the measures adopted to contain it have had a devastating impact on socioeconomic rights. These are rights, as you know, that are enshrined in our Constitution. Livelihoods have been destroyed, schooling disrupted, access to housing has been lost, and food insecurity and hunger has deepened. 3 million jobs were lost between February and April last year during the hard lockdown. And although there has been some recovery, the recent unemployment stats really show the depth of the crisis of poverty we are facing, with 32% being unemployed on the unexpanded rate. But if you include discouraged work seekers, it goes up to an unemployment rate of 43%, with a staggering youth unemployment of 74%. And of course, this is on top of the already pre-existing structural problems of poverty and inequality, with over 50% of the population living below the upper bound poverty line, and South Africa having one of the highest income and asset inequality indices in the world. Now, we know that government has tried to mitigate the impact of the pandemic through a range of relief programs, whether it's the TERS scheme for people in employment, or the reinstatement recently of the 350 Rand COVID social of relief of distress grant. However, it's clear that these measures, while important, will not have a sustained impact on poverty and inequality without a significant investment of resources in social and economic rights programs. And yet, as we all too aware, many developing countries, particularly in Africa, face major economic problems, massive declines to growth levels, burgeoning budget deficits, increased sovereign debt burdens, and the spiraling costs of debts due to the credit rating agency downgrades. And this has led countries such as South Africa to adopt fiscal consolidation or austerity programs, which have entailed massive cuts to government expenditure, which look set to have a profound impact over the medium term on the enjoyment of many economic and social rights. It's telling, for example, that budget cuts have even been blamed recently for the slow response of the security forces to the recent unrest and looting in South Africa. So the dilemma then is how to eradicate poverty and inequality that is eroding the foundations of our constitutional democracy in the context of a restrained resource environment. Now, typically, economists view this dilemma as one to be approached through the prism of the standard technical tools and principles of macroeconomic policy. However, the key message of my short intervention today is that the dilemma I have described cannot be resolved solely through the prism of economic policy principles. Economic policy decisions in this environment involve understanding the goals which we are trying to achieve, the impacts of various alternative decisions, the weighing of trade-offs, and the setting of appropriate priorities. And all these must be guided by the duties imposed on states, both in terms of our constitution, as well as in terms of the regional and international human rights instruments that South Africa has ratified at the international level. These include the African Charter on Human and People's Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. In fact, our Constitutional Court has made it clear that a failure to plan and budget for the fulfillment of constitutional obligations will not be accepted as an excuse. The UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights has also identified a number of principles that must be taken into account when so-called retrogressive measures are adopted. In other words, these are measures which reduce previous levels of economic and social rights enjoyment. They include careful analysis of the necessity of the measures, their proportionality, ensuring that poor and disadvantaged groups do not bear the brunt of the measures, as well as certain procedural steps, such as carrying out a proper human rights impact study in advance, providing for public participation, and monitoring the impact of such measures. So the aforesaid doctrine of retrogressive measures has also been relied on by our own courts. So, for example, last year, the North Gauteng High Court ruled that the suspension of the National School Nutrition Program when schools were closed down violated the constitutional rights of children to basic nutrition and a basic education, because hungry children can't learn properly. And it used the international doctrine of retrogressive measure to justify its reasoning in this case. I have also, in a recent paper, which is to be published in the South African Journal on Human Rights, argued that the doctrine of retrogressive measures has impacts for the program of fiscal consolidation, which government embarked upon in its medium-term budgetary policy statement in October last year. So in conclusion, my key message is that the education and practice of economics should include human rights law. This is not only because economic policy decisions that do not take human rights into account risk being set aside by a court or criticized by an international treaty body. More fundamentally, it is because human rights are based on fundamental ethical values of human dignity, equality, freedom, and Ubuntu, and that respecting and giving effect to human rights ensures that economic policy aims are aligned with these foundational constitutional values. So my key message really then is that human rights and economic policy should be engaged in a mutual dialogue, and this becomes even more important in a time of crisis such as the present. And I will leave that at now. Thanks very much, Judith.
Thank you very much, Sandy, for that very lucid presentation, and I look forward to exploring some of those ideas in our Q&A, particularly around issues of budgetary constraints and also public participation in budget processes. And the human rights lens, I think, is a crucial one, as you've argued. We're now going to hand over to Elmin du Plessis. Elmin's recorded presentation will follow. Thank you.
Today, I'm thankful for being with you to talk about this riveting topic, and I look forward to the discussion that will follow. I want to first transform you back to March 2020. It seems like a lifetime away, yes, but imagine that the past few months alert was raised about the new virus. We know very little about this virus, except it's a corona-type virus, but we don't know how it spread, we don't know how deadly it is. All we know is that it wreaked havoc in Wuhan. We are watching what's happening in Lombardy, Italy. We see army trucks outside hospital. New York is also not looking too well. These are countries with relatively good healthcare systems. We know our healthcare system has been lacking. We have no idea what the effect of this virus will be on people living with HIV. One by one, countries are closing down. We watch clips of funny Italian mayors telling the people to stay off the street. We are glued to our phones to try and understand what's going on, of how we must behave in order not to get the virus. Then the news. The first case is recorded in South Africa. We knew it would only be a matter of time before government had to take drastic action. We were confronted with various models on how this virus might possibly play out in South Africa, and some of them were really devastating. As cities and countries were closing down one by one, us lawyers started asking questions about the constitutionality of some of these measures and how state can and should respond. With South Africa being constitutional democracy, the questions were how to respond within the parameters of our constitution. It was the first time in our constitutional democracy that we were faced with a global, let alone a national crisis that needed to be managed. So early March, in the height of fear and anxiousness, the government had to take action with very little knowledge about the virus. The government had to devise a plan to decide the South African way forward. And people in government, probably dealing with their own fears and uncertainty, because officials and politicians are persons too, people too, humans, they had to make these decisions under those circumstances. What complicates a response in South Africa even further is that we are a country with such vast socio-economic differences, different experiences and needs. How must the government make regulations that are equally applicable to all citizens regardless of our vastly different world experiences? And should the rules in the densely populated Gauteng be the same as in the sparsely populated Northern Cape? When the quiet of mid-March dawned on many households, many officials were working frantically behind the scenes, writing regulations with no blueprint of curtailing the spread of an unknown virus to ensure that there is not an overload on our already overloaded, precarious health system. Today we are 508 days into lockdown, and we gather here online as we have gotten used to in these 508 days to talk about the government's legal and regulatory response to COVID. The focus is specifically about mine, at least, the choices that government had and assessing those choices looking back. 2020, they say. So the state had mainly three options to deal with the pandemic: the Disaster Management Act, a state of emergency, and national healthcare legislation. But I have to admit that before the pandemic, I was not that much aware of the Disaster Management Act. I had some interaction with people in disaster management before, mostly in environmental law areas, but the Act itself only became a close acquaintance the past year, also thanks to the wonderful interaction with my colleagues, some of whom spoke to you in the previous session. They would have informed you that the Disaster Management Act focuses on risk reduction and creates various institutions that should constantly devise risk plans to drive education on risk reduction. In that sense, the Act is not something that you can just actually pull out and utilize once the disaster strikes. It is legislation that requires a constant implementation to ensure that once there is a hazard, we can either avoid it becoming a disaster or we can lessen the impact once there is a disaster. Due to my ignorance, I must admit, my own initial hesitancy as to the applicability of the Act in April last year. But as legal scientists, we keep an open mind and we are open for persuasion. So after collaborating with the above-mentioned colleagues, and after having the issues aired and explained in court cases, I have found that it is actually the best option in managing a pandemic. There are still some fault lines that we will get to, but the state of emergency in the end was not an option because there's a threshold requirement that it can only be applicable if it is needed to restore peace and order, and that was not met, at least not yet. The National Health Act, or legislation in the national health sphere, was also an option, but a limited option. It allows, for instance, for testing and quarantine, but it's doubtful if a lockdown and other measures like wearing masks to address the spread of COVID would be possible using this or any other ordinary legislation. It can perhaps come into play later again in the next few months as the vaccine rates go up, immunity, a form of herd immunity is reached, and it negates the need for all these lockdown measures, but this requires some thinking. So what are the shortcomings of choosing a disaster management response? For me, the shortcoming is not so much in the Act itself, but rather in its implementation. The Act should be implemented also in times of no disaster or hazards as a way to prevent or reduce the risk and to have plans ready should a disaster strike. The reason why this might not have been the case previously is that the responsible government for the Act is the Department of Cooperative Governance, while the Presidency might be better suited for this Act. That was at least what the drafters had in mind. This ensures that disaster management is everyone's problem, from the Presidency to premiers to municipal officers. This then also speaks to the institutions that the Act creates. These should function optimally, especially the Interministerial Committee. And then the fact that regulations are not required to lie in front of Parliament for input from parties, that might be the one big problem of the Act, because that is the case in the case of a state of emergency. While it is within the powers of the Minister to make regulations within the confines of the Act, so all her powers were exercised legally, the fact that the state of disaster is an emergency situation where regulation making takes place quite quickly and with relatively little consultation, such a requirement of these pieces of legislation lying in front of a Parliament for input will bolster democracy and allow for multi-party participation. This is especially so when the immediate threat of the novelty of the virus wanes, which we are arguably now at. Currently, there is a private member's bill in front of Parliament that suggests an amendment to the Act to insert the same safeguards as in a state of emergency into the Disaster Management Act. I doubt if the bill will get traction because it is introduced by the Freedom Front Plus and the measures are fairly stringent, but I do agree with the idea and I do hope that government consider inserting provisions to provide for more parliamentary oversight in the process of making the regulations. With regard to the actual regulations themselves, there were also some hiccups. For one, it is important that the regulations are clear and clearly communicated to the public, and this was not always done, optimally at least. People were unsure. We think of the beach restrictions end of last year, the transportation of alcohol, cooked chicken, do you remember that? And open-toe shoes, but also more seriously perhaps the criteria for qualifying for business relief. There were also at times a disparity between the regulations as communicated through press releases before the publications of the regulations and then the actual regulations themselves. So my biggest problem lies with the transparency of the decision-making process. It is difficult to ascertain how decisions are made and where the decision-making takes place. For instance, the role of the National Corona Command Council was initially very unclear. First, there was uncertainty on who sits on the council, and when it transpired it is a cabinet committee, it was unclear what role they played, especially when all the ministers became members of the Corona Command Council. So the cabinet is also not an open forum, which means that citizens don't know how these decisions are made. Some of the information only came out after the state was taken to court. Here I think specifically of the tobacco cases. Then the question of proportionality of rules and responses also come into play, where the main concern for me is the criminalization of specific actions and the harsh enforcement, at least initially. Vulnerable groups are also disproportionately affected by COVID, and COVID also had a great gendered impact, and the regulations contributed to this to a great degree. They are also concerned about the oversight functions of Parliament and the courts. Initially, Parliament suspended its activities, and a month later they resumed virtually, although it was a very slow start. So the Helen Suzman Foundation did go to court to challenge the perceived absence of Parliament and the lack of oversight mechanisms. They ultimately lost, but there are valuable lessons that can be taken from the case, namely that it should be ensured that the legislature do continue to do its ordinary functions as soon as possible and to provide oversight to the executive powers. Judicial oversight was present. It was possible to go to court, and there were many court cases, and also to test the measures, which also happened, although in my opinion the courts deferred quite a lot to the decision-making power of the executives. but this seems to be an international trend. So if I think back of the lessons learned, I do think the Disaster Management Act was the right choice, but care should be taken not to undermine the democratic order. I also think trust and trustworthiness should be built on. Government should speak with one clear voice and not try to silence critical voices, but instead engage with it. We should strengthen the culture of scientific thinking, which requires rigorous engagement and an openness even in a time of uncertainty. And of course, as I learned, the ability to be persuaded once information becomes available. I thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much. Elmin will join us later. Without further ado, I'm handing over to Moses. Dr. Kangadi, over to you. Thank you.
No, thank you, Judith, and good afternoon once more. And thank you for the opportunity to form part of this important discussion. I think from the conversations that we have had as we were preparing for this, I'm going to look largely on the Disaster Management Act. I'm going to put up 2 slides that I have prepared for this purpose, so that I could just, make my inputs. What I thought was also important, facilitator, was that as much as one has 10 minutes and could not be in a position to go through, all the slides extensively, I thought it was important to highlight the importance of legislation within the disaster management environment. And I think that's what Prof. Elmin was talking to. So essentially, the message I wanted to convey here was that globally, it is accepted that for disaster risk reduction to have a strong institutional basis for implementation, you need to have fit-for-purpose policies and legislative frameworks in order to create a basis for the work that needs to be done. And I think what is also important to note is that good policy or legislation should provide a multi-sector framework for disaster risk reduction and institutions that are involved in the work of reducing risks and building resilience. The essence of perhaps what I would speak to a little bit is on this slide, where the request and the focus is on how it should work, perhaps versus how it worked. And I think Prof. Elmin in a presentation already covered a lot of elements that I thought I would also address. The first thing is that the Disaster Management Act is a fairly new legislation. I think globally respected in terms of its outlook and posture and the philosophical principles upon which it is based. And this legislation establishes disaster management centers across all the 3 spheres of government. And part of what was brought about by the new legislation was that it required the establishment of a national disaster management center, which is the principal functional unit for disaster management at national level. And the fundamental role of the National Disaster Management Center is to promote an integrated and coordinated system of disaster management with specific focus on risk reduction by organs of state and other role players. So I think that's a point that Elmin was also highlighting around the focus on risk reduction, as opposed to previous approaches where the focus was largely reactive. So the paradigm has shifted, and the legislation that we have reflects that change, global paradigm shift, where the focus is largely supposed to be on risk reduction. So the point that I think I want to raise is that the National Disaster Management Center plays a key role in the effective implementation of the Disaster Management Act. And from an institutional point, and I think it's something that was highlighted, the Act also calls for the establishment of an intergovernmental committee on disaster management, which must give effect to principles of cooperative governance on disaster management, and is therefore accountable to Cabinet for coordination of disaster management. So this is the structure, intergovernmental structure that should ordinarily play a key role on matters of disaster management. But another dimension which is important is that, and this also comes from the definition of disaster management within our environment, which emphasize where there's a lot of emphasis on multi-sectoral involvement. And the Disaster Management Act calls upon organs of state across all spheres to prepare disaster management plans. And these disaster management plans must outline how disaster management is going to be integrated and applied in a particular functional area. And disaster management responsibilities must be integrated into routine activities of sectors and disciplines within organs of state and their substructures. So in order for this to happen, it means that focal points or focal units should be established at sectors to basically drive coordination of disaster management activities within the sector. This is important because the National Disaster Management Center and its sub-national counterparts play a coordinating role. And that coordination presupposes that there will be sector-specific structures that will then be responsible to ensure that disaster management issues are integrated into the day-to-day service delivery, programming, and so on. So that is the way how perhaps with the 10 minutes that one have, I would want to just outline. My focus is largely on institutional machinery and supported by disaster management planning. But perhaps coming to how it worked, I think it was already been covered to a large extent by Prof. Elmin. We all know that once COVID-19 arrived in March 2020, that our president established a National Coronavirus Command Council, which was supported by a National Command Center. And at a implementation level, the net joints played a critical role to support implementation of COVID-19 response. From our side, as the National Disaster Management Center, we also activated our Disaster Operations Center, which was focusing on coordinating response of local government and disaster management stakeholders, but also responsible for interfacing with other, structures, including the net joints and other structures that were established. The command councils were also replicated at a subnational level, particularly at province and district and metros. And this at provincial level was supported by prof joints, which are essentially a similar structure to the net joints, but with a provincial focus. So 9 such prof joints were activated to try and coordinate response to this challenge that we had to deal with. And from a legal regulatory point of view, based on the Disaster Management Act, our minister issued regulations and directions that were outlining how we should respond, introducing restrictions and so on, as Prof was articulating. And important to note that other ministers were also able to issue sector-specific directions in order to coordinate response within their respective sectors. Of course, it is important to note that, as I conclude, facilitator, that there was no blueprint to outlining how you could respond to a virus, because this is a once in 100 years type of scenario that we have had to deal with. And there were challenges that were there. Some of them could have been historic or structural, but there were challenges. And part of the challenges that I thought I could just allude to include the fact that disaster management centers, at the point of responding, not all of them had all the capacity required. So there was a limit in relation to the capacity that also impacted on how such centers would therefore have to respond. Earlier, I spoke about the multi-sectoral nature of disaster management in South Africa, which presupposed that sectors would institutionalize. And we know that not all sectors, key sectors, have institutionalized disaster management within their departments. So that weak institutionalization means that it weakens your ability to do multi-sectoral coordination. I think previous speakers have spoken about this. I heard in the other session, and I think Prof. Elmin dealt with the issue of placement extensively. And our assessment is also that the placement of this function needs to be reconsidered so that you could strengthen its convening power and coordinating ability to deal with complex hazards like we have had to deal with COVID-19. Of course, very important dynamic that we had to deal with was that COVID-19 meant that you could no longer have physical meetings. Even our own disaster operations center could not accommodate all the people that you ordinarily would accommodate when you are dealing with a drought or a flood because of the nature of transmissions and so on. So we noted that most systems, municipalities and provinces did not have at the point of COVID-19 arriving the requisite ICT operational capabilities to be able to function virtually and online. So that took a bit of time. And that, of course, also impacted to a certain extent the response. I'm noting the point around standardized reporting systems, but very important link to capacity is the whole funding issue, which I think also requires consideration going into the future. And then lastly, I thought I would mention the point around COVID-19 impacts on disaster management practitioners as well. So that was also a complex factor that we had to deal with, where some of our heads of centers will be sick and be hospitalized, and in an environment where capacity is already limited. Once you get into a scenario where others are hospitalized, it weakens your ability to coordinate. And sadly, others also lost their lives and so on. So those are the challenges that one could just at a high level indicate we experienced as part of responding to COVID-19. So perhaps I will leave it there, facilitator, and could build further on some of these elements when we do questions and answers. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much to all three presenters. And Elmin is back with us. So there is a question in the chat, and as I mentioned before, if you have questions in the chat, please do let us have them. So I'm going to put the one to you, Sandy, which is from Dyson Kuna, who's an MPhil candidate. He says, is there not a strong connection between South Africa's inadequate dispensation of socio and economic rights with the weakened redistributive approach that the 94 transition adopted? So any thoughts on that? I mean, I suppose some of this is about, how one accommodates socioeconomic rights. When we were writing our constitution, we were bold, but then of course there are limitations to those rights. So Sandy, over to you.
Thanks very much, and thanks for a great question. I think this my own assessment would be that the answer to that question must lie in the fact of, South Africa's wealth and income distribution being so poor, and being one of the highest in the world, which to me indicates that there is indeed significantly more redistributive capacity than we think. I certainly believe that, we have not exhausted our taxation ability to redistribute wealth. One can speak also about asset redistribution, debates on the wealth tax. This is not just my own view. So when South Africa was reviewed on its initial report before the UN Committee on Economic and Social Rights, one of the criticisms was indeed that the extent of inequality signaled that the development path that South Africa was following was insignificantly inclusive. So I think we really do need to take a good hard look at the really staggering levels of asset and income inequality, and really take much more seriously, the redistributive potential that is there in our economy. And I know, of course, the argument is that higher taxes, scare off investment and business, and therefore lower growth facilities. But, and this is a question for the economists really, does the sort of, and the studies, the spirit level and studies, a lot of international studies that have shown that more unequal societies are more violent societies, more unstable societies, and the consequence of that is that it is not a good environment to do business. So surely, paying higher taxes to have a more stable, more just society is, a price well worth paying for the sustainability of our economy and our democracy. So I'll just leave it at that for now, Judith. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And then there's a question on the chat for Moses. Dr. Kangari, are there any recommendations for lessons learned going into the future? And somebody has asked whether the National Disaster Centre is fit for purpose, nevertheless. So Moses, perhaps you'd like to focus on that.
No, thanks. Thanks for the questions. I think there are recommendations that have been made in terms of improving the system going into the future. There was a lot of research that was done by the DPME in relation to assessing the entire response system. From our side, we are also working with the United Nations Development Program, where we have embarked on a program of COVID-19 review of the institutional structures and how we have responded. So there are a lot of good recommendations that are emerging around how things could be improved. There are issues around placement of the function. I think that's a dominant theme that is recurring around where the functions should be located. There are issues around funding modeling. How can we improve on those elements? There are issues around standardized reporting systems and so on. So there are a lot of recommendations that are emerging that are research-based, based on the experience of practitioners and so on. So we will be taking those issues into account going to the future. I think the question around whether the center is fit for purpose, I think my answer will be yes, it is fit for purpose, and perhaps it could benefit from enhanced capacity in order for it to live up to the expectations in terms of the legislation. So if you couple that with the appropriate location, and you equip it accordingly. I think the center will be able to, as it has done and demonstrated on other hazards that we have had to deal with in the many years that the Act and the center was established. So I think my short answer is yes, it is. It could be strengthened with capacity and appropriate convening power and location. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Moses. And I'm going to ask either Sandy or Elmin to come in to the question from Mariti Makola, which is about South Africa's good policies and laws and why are we unable to implement successfully? Is the capacity of the state developing so that it has the capacity to implement excellent policy with the legal tools available? And that sort of segued with the question that I had here around oversight. So if we're talking about the implementation of socioeconomic rights, if we're talking about this, the doctrine of non-retrogression, for instance, how we budget, seems to me to be somebody talked about the mutual dialogue. Sandy, it was you, I think. So how do we get all of these bits of government to have a dialogue with each other? And for me, it's also about transparency, as Elmin said, but also effective oversight and accountability. So the role of the executive, the role of parliament, and the role of institutions. We have a budget office of parliament. Is it fit for purpose? Is it doing its job? So perhaps I can expand that question to you, Sandy, and also Elmin, for you to come in. Thanks.
Thanks, Judith. I think the point you raise about transparency and participation and oversight is really critical in this area, because really you don't want the courts to be dictating particular policies to government. And, this obviously, budgetary and economic policy is very much sort of within the realm of the executive and parliament. So you need to have human rights factored into these processes. So I don't know the details of how the budget office in parliament is working, but there are now very detailed, the independent expert on foreign debt of the UN has developed a set of principles on human rights impact assessments of economic reforms. These should be taken into account by Treasury when they, develop their medium-term budgetary policy statements. And I think an important point is also, as you said, Parliament's oversight role. And in terms of the Money Bills Amendment Act of 2018, Parliament does now have amendment powers with regard to the money bills and division of revenue and fiscal frameworks. But, I don't think these powers are sufficiently used or interrogated around constitutional demands. And just the last point I want to make on this, South Africa, in terms of the Open Budgets International Survey, scores very high on the transparency. Along with New Zealand, it's along the top of the transparency of its budget process with something like 87 of 100. But it is amongst the lowest on the participation in budgetary processes with a score of 24 out of 100. And I think civil society organizations have really complained about insufficiently meaningful opportunities to input in budgetary processes at both executive and parliamentary levels, insufficient timeframes, insufficient possibilities to really engage with these processes. So I think designing better participatory processes is one way to really strengthen this human rights element in budgetary processes.
Thanks very much. I've just got a note that we need to be wrapping up, but Elmina, I want to put that question to you, and maybe just a double one, and I'll go around to ask everyone for a last word, because looking at this through a gendered lens and how women often have borne the brunt within the disproportionately within the state of disaster and in the past year. And then, Elmin, I had a question about a state of disaster versus a state of emergency, because those conversations have been happening after the violence that we saw in July. So take your pick on those, and then I'll go around to Sandy and Moses as well for last thoughts before we wrap up. Thank you.
Great, thanks. I'm very glad that Sandy handled that other question first, because I think the issue of implementation is a great frustration, not only in disaster management overall. I mean, working in land reform and housing, we are just as frustrated. And some of the solutions that came forth in courts, at least, is to hold specific officials accountable and to threaten either with cost orders in court or with contempt of court orders to ensure that they actually, implement the policy that's there. And that might be the only way forward. So I think one of the questions here is, how do we design rules and policies to help with that constraint? But I also think a lot of that links in, and it's going to link into many things that was said now, but Sandy's comment about participation. I also find, if you look at COVID and you look at these COVID regulations, I'm sitting here this morning and I'm writing on how decisions are made. The decision-making process is not that transparent. The people that make these decisions are, you will remember last year, June, July, August, people who spoke out against the method that government took, they were fired from, or they were excused. Sorry, let me just use the words that government used, from these councils. But and that's, I think, what I meant with a sort of a scientific way of thinking about things, to be open to dissenting views and to engage with it, so that we as a society can say, okay, so this is how science works. People don't always agree. It's also possible that, last year in March, we thought airborne, we don't need to use masks, but we now have more information, and science works like that when you have more information, you can change policies and things. And I think that also comes in there. And then part of the participatory thing that's very, very important is that gendered impact, right? So I'm very privileged. I can work at home. My children can work online, but I had productivity labs because I had to, all of a sudden, I wasn't the online teacher, I was an IT professional. But even on me, who can relatively well cushion myself against these things, I have felt there's a gendered impact. But I think those Graham studies showed that, the poorer you are, the more of a gendered impact you had with these ECD schools closing. And I do think when you have women in the decision-making process, and you have women of all spheres of life in that process, that you will be able to have a more rounded approach. And the WHO also, in their research, showed that the more you approach people to include them in decision-making processes in ways that the rules make sense to them, the more there will be compliance with the rules. So I think all those kind of things become quite important. And then that also goes back to the implementation, because the Disaster Management Act does make provision for all these kinds of forums where people from different levels can participate in the decision-making. Why is it not happening? Because that would have been ideal. Thank you.
Excellent. Moses, a last word from you before we have to wrap up.
No, thanks, Judith, and thanks to my co-panelists. I think I will just make 3 points. Firstly, I think the Disaster Management Act has proven its utility and robustness, in terms of anchoring our response to COVID-19 since March 2020. And I think it has enabled us to navigate complex, COVID-19 response situations. But I want to also be upfront to say lessons learned from COVID-19 and the points that the panelists are raising could improve the system going into the future. So I think if we are to face another in COVID-30, COVID-38, whatever period, we should be in a better position based on the lessons that we have learned now. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry to that we've run out of time, because this is obviously a very broad topic. But thank you for all the questions in the chat, and a special thank you to our panelists, to Sandy, to Moses, and to Elmin. I'm now going to hand over to our next speaker, who's Professor Charles Wassungi. Charles is the director of Cochrane South Africa, the South African Medical Research Council, and an extraordinary professor of global health at the University of Stellenbosch, and also an honorary professor of epidemiology at the University of Cape Town. A substantial part of his research is focused on vaccine uptake and hesitancy. And I'm quite sure that this is more than relevant for the moment we are in. So thank you very much, everyone. And I'll hand over to Professor Wassungi.